stage Doug McMartin from Caltech, Jane Long from EDF, Tom, not from EDF. I mean, you've got so many affiliations. How should I refer to you? Jane Long, unaffiliated, Tom Armstrong, Madison River Group, and Ted Parson from UCLA. We're going to start with Doug.
What's the easiest? All right.
There's a clicker here if you want to stay where you are, or you can come to the podium.
Doesn't matter. I'll stand up. Laser pointer.
So the timekeeper's at the back of the room. He'll hold the sign with 5 minutes left.
Okay. So I get the privilege of kicking everything off here and trying to give a really, really compressed overview of why we're talking about geoengineering, and I'm sure some subset of what I will say people already know. So I actually want to start with this picture. This is trying to figure out what the best place to stand is.
I'm going to give this to you, Doug, just for the recording, if you don't mind.
Right.
Thanks.
So I actually want to start with this picture. How you frame geoengineering tends to have a big impact on how people tend to react to it. If you fundamentally believe that the role of solar radiation management is a get-out-of-jail-free card, so we don't have to cut emissions, we could just keep burning as much fossil fuel as we want, and then we'll fix the problem with solar radiation management, then first of all you need a very, very large radiative forcing. That's not actually clear that's even technically possible, and you need to do that for a long time here being measured in multiple thousands of years, and I would say there is not a single serious person on the planet who thinks that this is a good idea. The alternative, in some sense, would be you cut carbon emissions as aggressively as you can. Hopefully at some point in the future, one develops the technology to suck some of that CO2 out of the atmosphere. CDR also gets sometimes lumped under geoengineering. If you do both of those things, there is likely to still be a fair amount of climate impacts, and then there's a potential role for geoengineering to basically reduce those impacts in the meantime. And if you were to try to quantify these axes, that might be trying to reduce the temperature of the planet by a couple of degrees at most. This might still be measured in centuries. You might think these are sort of two end members. This is sort of the idealized view that the existence of geoengineering has absolutely no impact on the trajectory for mitigation. Reality may lie somewhere in between these. That is, the existence of this technology might impact the amount of mitigation. That's referred to as the moral hazard. And where you fall on the category of we think the existence of geoengineering is going to lead to this scenario versus this scenario tends to be a pretty good indicator of whether you think it's a good idea to pursue or not. And the bottom line here is simply in this view, it's plausible that it would reduce the amount of suffering on the planet. There's clearly an awful lot more research that still needs to be done. So I'm just going to set a little bit more background here. These are all of the working group 3 scenarios in the IPCC. All of the scenarios that reach 2 degrees by the end of the century either require negative emissions, which we actually don't know how to do at the scale indicated in this plot, or they require time travel. We needed to have started cutting those emissions 5 years ago. This little arrow I added here, somebody has done an analysis suggesting that that amount of carbon dioxide removal requires planting half of the US with bioenergy crops and then sequestering all of the resulting carbon. If you look at the Paris pledges, this is just sort of a rough estimate. Great agreement in principle. It pulls us off of this sort of business as usual red curve, but more or less it moves us to a weaker growth in net emissions. And by the end of those Paris pledges, we'll be sort of on the high end of these gold scenarios, probably aiming for somewhere in the 2.5 to 3 degree warming range. One technical note, If you were to hold concentrations at fixed level, the planet would continue to warm just because of the inertia. We're not yet in equilibrium. If you were to zero emissions completely at one point in time, magically, the atmospheric concentration would drop a little bit just because the oceans aren't yet in equilibrium. They'll still suck up a little bit. Those two effects roughly balance so that if you were to zero emissions, you get roughly constant temperature for the next several centuries at least. The upshot of that is the only way to actually reduce temperatures is with solar geoengineering. That's also background. If you were to plot global mean temperature, actually plots in the models fairly well against cumulative CO2 emissions. When this plot was made, we were down here around this box. Right now, we're closer to 2,000 gigatons CO2 and closer to a degree of warming. Probably slightly more if you took out the aerosol cooling we have. In order to keep to 2-degree warming, estimate is we need about to keep to, I think it's 2,900 gigatons of CO2, of which we've emitted about 2,000. The other thing to put in, if you add up all of the infrastructure that's already been built, all of the cars and power plants and so forth on the road, cars on the road, power plants, wherever they are, an estimate for that, if you allow it to live out its useful life, is about 700 gigatons of CO2. So that would say if you want to maintain below 2 degrees, the very, very last piece of anything that you ever build that emits carbon will get built in the next couple of years. And anything that gets built after the year 2018 blows the 2-degree budget. So if you believe that we can actually maintain, so technically, it's still possible to meet a 2-degree target, but practically that option no longer exists. So just remind you of this plot. When we do eventually stabilize our emissions, that will stabilize temperature. That number is not going to be 2 degrees.
Sorry, Doug, when you said, what's the probability you'll get? I mean, is this
Sorry, that's 66.
very likely, or?
That's 2/3 probability. The 2,900 number is the 2/3 probability. So that sort of motivated all of the discussion about geoengineering. I will just very, very briefly introduce this because you'll hear a lot more about this the rest of the day. The two main ideas that are discussed, one is in some sense motivated by looking at what happens after a volcanic eruption. Planet gets cooler. This is obviously very robust. Every major eruption, the planet gets cooler because of putting sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. The reason this is the idea that is most frequently discussed is because I would say we're 100% confident that this would cool the planet. Different statement from saying whether it's a good idea. The other idea that's that's often discussed, and where Tom will talk more about this afternoon, is marine cloud brightening. So this is a picture off the coast. So these are ocean clouds. Every one of these lines here is a ship track. So at the head of this, there's a ship. It dumped a bit of pollution in its exhaust. That pollution formed cloud condensation nuclei, and for the next week or so, in the right cloud conditions, you'll see a cloud behind that. And so you don't need to dump pollution to do that. The idea would be you spray salt water into low marine clouds. That makes the clouds brighter. So those are sort of the two main ideas that you'll hear about. I'm just going to briefly introduce model results. So these are average over, or say median response across 12 geomint models that just turned the sun down. And I rescaled these to what you would expect, consistent with a scenario like this one, where you're sort of trying to compensate for about half of the global mean temperature rise. And if you look at temperature, everywhere on the planet gets colder in every single model. That's no big surprise. If you look at precipitation, most places in the planet, in most models, actually have a precipitation that's closer to pre-industrial with some amount of geoengineering than they do without it. But that's not true everywhere, and and in every model there is at least somewhere where that's not true. So there's a pile of things to comment on here. So first of all, temperature and precipitation aren't the only things that you care about. Second, these are models. Third, this is just turning the sun down. This is not putting stratospheric aerosols in there. putting in stratospheric aerosols might do better than this, and it might do worse. One of the reasons it might do better, if you look really closely here, this overcooled the tropics relative to the poles. You don't, if you're doing this with stratospheric aerosols, for example, you can put more injection up at the poles if you want and less in the tropics. So you do get some ability to design things. And the only real reason for mentioning that is this is sort of, we tried one thing in a climate model, this is what happened. That's not saying that's what would happen with geoengineering. You may be able to do better than that, better in whatever metric you choose. So Simone will talk more about modeling results this afternoon, I think. Anything critical I should mention right now? I think I've said all of this, so why do it? Ideally reduces climate damage, only fast thing. Why not? The biggest concern that's been raised is all the societal feedbacks. There's lots of other side effects. If you do this with stratospheric aerosols, you do get ozone depletion. You turn the skies white. This is the reason why we're all here. Who gets to make the decisions? How does this affect regional inequality? And then, of course, like I showed, climate models aren't the real world. And so how do you deal with the uncertainty in that? I think I said most of this. There's two things I want to point out here. One is it's relatively cheap. You could have an observable effect with a relatively few airplanes flying aerosols up into the stratosphere. So of order billions of dollars, you could have a measurable effect. The other thing is this is reversible. You can say that is a good thing or a bad thing, but if you turn it off, you more or less go back to where you were. Obviously, if you've been doing this for a long time and then you turn it off, that very rapid temperature change is itself a problem. I'm not going to read through the list of all the things that we don't know. The reason for putting up this list is simply to point out how long that list is. If you wanted to fly airplanes up to the stratosphere in a few years, you probably could. If you wanted to actually make sure you understood what was going on before you did that, we're probably 20 years of research away from being able to do that. So my own view is this is not near term. The other reason for putting up this long list, some of these things you could probably answer with modeling. A lot of this stuff may require some degree of process field tests. And that does not mean going out and trying this at scale and seeing what the climate response is. Both Tom and Frank will probably talk about experiments. When one's talking about field experiments, generally the first things that come up are very small scale things trying to understand process uncertainties in the model. So I will, I'm not sure how I did on time. I want to leave time for the rest of the panel, so I'll stop there. Just trying to see if there's anything I forgot to say. I think that was my quick summary.
Excellent.
Does this work? Is this on? Okay, great. I'm going to talk from here. Doug had the best slides, so I can't compete with that. I'll just have to talk. I'm going to, first of all, I want to say that I think this project is a really wonderful idea. The idea that you, the academic group, have come together with a very interesting background, appropriate to now entering this space of geoengineering. Very difficult problem, difficult issue, and certainly, if I was going to give I'd like to introduce myself as being retired, but that's because I think this, and the reason I'm still here is because this is by far the most interesting topic that I ever got involved in my life. It really involves every single thing you would ever be interested in as from a scientific and social perspective. So congratulations for coming to the table. Welcome. And also just want to say a couple of words about the organization of our panel so you know how this fits together. Doug gave you the motivation. We are seeing in the climate change arena that it doesn't, based on what we know, the best knowledge we have, which is these models that predict the future, we aren't going to make the targets that we have set for ourselves simply with mitigation. And that is a profoundly problematic situation. And I think Doug did a really good job of showing you that. Now, I always like to make sure people understand, and Doug said it clearly, these are model results. We don't know how to predict the future. It might not come out this way, but the bottom line is it's the best we know. We don't have a better way to understand what might happen based on what we have done here on Earth. So it behooves us to do something about it. We really do need to understand what our options are. And so my purpose here is to talk to you about starting research on this topic and what the problems are. And after that, you're going to hear from Tom, who comes out of the government, just recently retired from the government, but he's not retired either. And he's going to tell you a little bit about what it's like to deal with this problem within the government. And then Ted will come in and talk to you about the state of issues on international and national governance that will come out. So we're the overview panel. So I think that basically we have seen through the fact that research hasn't started, that the social science issues, the STS type issues, have been explored very extensively compared to the scientific issues right now. And what we see is that it's really clear in this controversial type technology that we start this research in the right way, that it needs to be a deliberative start, that we are not going to just backdoor get a line item in some bill. One of the things I did in the past was chair the BPC task force on geoengineering. We made a recommendation to start research, but we had panel members from all walks of life, including panel members from the military-industrial complex. And their recommendation to us was, hey, this isn't a problem. You just go to Senator so-and-so and get a line item. And this is not what we want to do. Would not be appropriate for this level of difficult problem. So we need to be careful that it's not haphazard, that it's deliberate, that it's transparent. And so the issue becomes really how do you start research in a way that does that? And the main point that I want to make today is that the whole development of governance on this topic, as was recommended in our task force report, and I very strongly believe needs to evolve along with that research. You can't start research without it, but you can't get governance way out in front of the research either. And so the thing that we feel is what we felt in that task force report, and which I stand by, is that they need to be commensurate. The actions need to be commensurate. And I think that's going to figuring out how to do that was the topic of a workshop that we ran almost 2 years ago now, where we looked at some of the experiments you're going to hear about in the next panel. We looked at experiments that people might propose to come out with at the first step. So one of the things that has changed in this field is 5 or 10 years ago, people thought that there were only two kinds of things that you could do. You could run models and you could change the climate of the Earth. Those were the only two experiments that you could run. One totally inside your head and inside the computer, maybe completely wrong, and the other one carrying huge risk. And so a lot of the governance ideas that came out were very much geared to that type of understanding of what research was. Over these past few years, it's become clear that there is a whole range of experiments, starting with laboratory experiments, going into the atmosphere and doing something very small and insignificant from a risk perspective, but important from understanding the dynamics that would control geoengineering results. And so given that information, it became pretty obvious that you could start research and go outside without perturbing the climate of the Earth. And that is a huge opportunity for governance, because if you start governance at the same time, then you are appropriately building, as you build the scientific questions that you're answering the governance questions in a way that steps forward along with that problem. So, for example, if you It's been proposed, I think, at one time that you could just say, well, we're not going to do any research outside that's more than a millionth of a watt per meter. Well, you know, experiments might not involve any forcing of climate, and yet they would be too dangerous to do. So there is no simple way to say this is a limit. It's going to be a very complicated process, but we are really fortunate because the first experiments that might be done are ones that are clearly of very, very low risk. And so we can begin to assemble the type of advisory committees and types of transparency processes that we need. So I want to say that in the workshop that we ran 2 years ago, we assembled a set of what we thought the governance issues were. And then we compared them against these, a set of experiments that had been proposed in a previous workshop at Harvard that was, Doug was one of the organizers of. And so we had a set of clear experiments that ranged from things that were very low risk to things that would actually perturb the climate. And we compared them against this set of governance issues. The first was value, that that these experiments should have both scientific and social value. In other words, they should provide they should be of the highest scientific value. They should resolve uncertainties. They should generate new understanding. And if they don't do that, then why are you doing them at all? They also can have social values. Social value might be that people prefer to understand certain aspects of the climate system versus others. So that is sort of a sine qua non for moving forward. Then the risks posed by the research that should be evaluated. And those risks can be from just the fact that it could be from the fact that you're putting a high level of forcing into the atmosphere, but it also could just be that it's a very long experiment or that it's very broad, that might cross national boundaries, and so there are risks that have to be evaluated. The third category was transparency. And this is extremely important, and I think something that scientists are going to have a lot of trouble with, because I don't think that we as, I trained people to get proposals funded, and I think in a lot of ways that's training people to not be transparent, because you basically look at the program that you're trying to get money from, and you figure out how to cast your research in a way that gets money from that program, not in terms of why you really are doing that research. And it's the why. What does that research really mean that becomes important in this field? It's like, what is our state? Being transparent about what our state of knowledge is, what we know, what we don't know, or how well we know it, how good our data is, how much we can do with this experiment, what do we expect the results to be, how do I know I got those results, and after I get those results and they're not the same as what I expected, how do I explain that and explain what I'm going to do next? All of those things have to do with the meaning of research, and that is something we are not, as scientists, very well trained to do. And I think it is critical that we learn how to do this. I only have 5 more minutes, oh my goodness. And then finally, the vested interests have to be explored. And there are all kinds of vested interests. They are not vested interests that necessarily have to do with financial vested, are the most common, but we have a lot of institutional vested interests. If we vest an institution in developing a particular technology, they're going to want to show that it's great. I come from a background of nuclear waste storage where companies were given the job of showing that we could do nuclear waste storage at Hanford, and they changed the data so that it looked better. I mean, it's really important to recognize that institutional vested interest is enormous and has to be really watchdogged. So there are methods that we have to develop to deal with these different kinds of vested interests, including that of the scientist who wants to be the one that saves the world. So we need to have different ways, and peer review, the normal peer review process is not going to be sufficient in my view for this. We're going to have other ways. And I won't talk about the legal considerations because I think Ted will probably talk about that. I just want to talk about what to do. I think the important thing is we need to come up with those first set of experiments, the outdoor experiments that we're going to do. We need to understand exactly what they are. They need to be low risk, they need to be, or negligible risk, they need to be very high scientific quality. And we need to use those as a way to decide how we're going to watch this research and develop transparency and increase public deliberation about this topic. So I start with some definition of some real projects and use them. One of the key things is there has to be independent advice. There has to be broad-based independent advice, and that body needs to be formed. That's critical. Because that will travel all the way through. It may become a body with authority, but over time, but even without authority, it will have implicit moral authority, and it's really important that that take place. I think, secondly, the processes and ability to learn how to be transparent needs to start right at the beginning, and so we need to use these first projects to learn that technique, and also the extra peer review. And third, we need to start with the engagement of the public about exactly what's happening and why, and build that into the narrative of the complete symphony of things that we need to do about climate. This is, as Doug showed very eloquently, this is only one. It has to be seen in that context, and we need to have that dialogue and increase that dialogue. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Good morning. This is going to be a little bit new for me, not the subject, but the presentation. I am not using slides. I'm a recovering slideaholic. I tend to show about 30 slides and talk very quick, and as one of my colleagues said, Tom gives a good talk, but it's a very fast bus. So having left the government and started my own company, my goal now is to slow it down and look out the bus window and enjoy the ride a little bit more, and hopefully in doing so, leave you with a little less, but maybe a little bit more rich information. So just a little bit of background why I'm up here. I am not, I certainly don't have the technical background for climate engineering or solar radiation management that my three colleagues have, but as a scientist, I'm a geologist, studied plate tectonics, and then it's a long story it involves alcohol and manipulation that got me into climate change many years ago. But I certainly know climate change science, and having worked as a advisor to Secretary Ken Salazar, former Interior Secretary during the Obama administration, Secretary Kempthorne under the Bush administration at DOI, and most recently at the White House under the President's administration from 2011 to 2014 as an advisor and the executive director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is, if you haven't heard of USGCRP, it's an amalgamation of 13 federal agencies with an annual budget of $2.5 billion. It makes it, frankly, the largest climate change research program in the world by far. We could talk more about the fact that it's 13 agencies with their own mission mandates. That's another part of the story. But the reason I'm really up here is to take the rich body of technical information that Doug set us up with, that Jane articulated in terms of where do we go from here, and that I know Ted will ably conclude with and leave you with an effective charge. I want to give you some of my experiences working at the White House, at DOI, and at USGCRP about this subject, and talk about how we generated the policy framework for climate change writ large, and where and why not, in some cases, climate engineering or climate intervention, including solar radiation management, did not fit into that policy framework, but why they need to be considered moving forward. I think that Doug already stole the show with the reasons, but we'll go back over that a little bit and talk about that in a second. But let me bring you back to 2011 when I started at the White House. I was fresh out of the Department of the Interior as a climate advisor to Ken Salazar and Deputy Secretary David Hayes, where at DOI, because their main responsibility is land management and management of wildlife, waters, people's cultural values, especially indigenous people's values. The real thrust and gist of the work that I did there in developing policy, science policy, centered around adaptation, the things that we could actually do on the ground in terms of major management decisions and policy decisions that would affect how people responded to the impacts and effects of climate change. And I can tell you, not just in Alaska, but throughout the world, the major holdings and responsibilities we had at DOI, it was way before 2011 that we knew that we had a serious problem with the impacts and effects of climate change, and that climate change was something real that needed to be dealt with. By 2011, when I got to the White House, we were working on the development under the leadership of the President's science advisor, Dr. John Holdren. We were working on that policy framework, and it was if you think of it as a stool, the stool had 3 legs. The first leg of that policy framework was mitigation, and it was the issue of trying to pass through legislation, but acknowledging that legislation was not going to work, that we would start to develop a strategy for mitigation at the executive level, in the executive office, with executive orders. That at the heart and soul of everything we were doing, no matter what we were doing about adaptation, we needed to have a solid framework of reducing carbon pollution emissions to the atmosphere from that day on. And I think time will tell how successful we're going to be with COP21 and other things that are part of the President's executive orders. But it was really very much that policy leg number 1 was built around emission reductions through executive orders. The second piece, which we were very careful, I hope you'll agree if you've seen any of the policy framework itself, that we were trying to inextricably tie to mitigation, and policy framework element number 1 was adaptation. And I can tell you in my experience at DOI, at the U.S. Geological Survey, and in the early days up on at the White House, working up on Capitol Hill, that we were making some real progress on the issue of embedding adaptation as a serious policy framework for both legislation as well as executive orders from the executive office. And one of the ways, and I'm going to give up the secret that we found, and I found earlier in my days at DOI, was to focus on observations of impacts and effects when talking about adaptation, and not so much causality. When you talk about causality, you raise a whole level of political flare-up and tension that really isn't necessary in order to pass sound legislation when it comes to the issue of dealing with what you actually see on the ground or in the sky or in people and places and things. So adaptation was something that we were making headway on as the policy framework element number 2, but we were very careful to make sure that we were educating people along the way as we could to the fact that successful adaptation, especially going into the future, going back to Doug's slides about the business as usual scenario that we knew we were on, if we were going to be successful in adapting to anything on the ground, especially in places like Alaska, we needed to be tied to the policy framework for mitigation. Successful adaptation, or the probability of success, is greatly enhanced by the aggressiveness that you take, the level of aggression in dealing with emission reductions. Now, let me pause with adaptation there and say that there was a third leg to the stool. And I wish John Holdren was here to talk about it, because he does a much more eloquent job than I can. But that third leg is simply what some people call business as usual, what we called both the worst choice as well as suffering. And that is to basically continue down the path we were already on. And that path was a decision that was probably the worst decision we could make, because it wasn't based on science, it wasn't based on economics, it wasn't based on social values, it wasn't based on anything that should go into sound policy development. It was just inertia in the system that was leading us down a road to continuing the way we were and saying this is a problem for the next generation. Fortunately, we had leadership at the White House, thanks to John, thanks to the President, that made sure that we did not accept that as a logical or worthwhile policy framework element, and that was basically cast aside. But there was early on talk about a fourth policy element, and that element was climate intervention or climate engineering, geoengineering, including things like solar radiation management, and also calling to the table the issue of carbon dioxide reduction. Excuse me. But that, for many reasons, did not go very far in our discussions, and I'll tell you some of the reasons why. One of them was that even at the White House, which was gearing up very early on for discussions at the United Nations on climate, the Climate Convention in New York, as well as planning for IPCC and for the UNFCCC COPs, starting with COP16 and moving most recently up into COP21. There was always a concern, never really mentioned outright publicly, but there was always this innate concern that if we started talking about climate intervention or climate engineering, it would distract people from focusing on the policy issue at hand, the one we were all after, which was emissions reduction. Another reason for the fact that we were not talking about climate intervention is that a lot of people were worried about, as Doug and Jane pointed out, about the level of science understanding at that point in time, that what we had seen in terms of several hand-picked examples of experimentation was that in some cases, the secondary effects of actually implementing climate engineering were having unplanned and unproven, or let me call them unintended consequences, some of which were as big as the problem we were trying to face itself. So that idea of secondary effects and unintended consequences, regardless of fact or fiction, was something that was real, and it was felt in different places at the highest levels of the government. We felt it at the agencies, we certainly saw it in the White House, and you definitely could hear it up on Capitol Hill. But at the same, 5 minutes, thank you. At the same time, there was also some work going on up on the Hill, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, I don't think that would be appropriate, where some people in congressional leadership were starting to just talk about climate intervention as the silver bullet. That if we could go right to deployment of engineering solutions to reduce carbon from the atmosphere, we wouldn't really have to place as much emphasis on emissions reductions, and we wouldn't have to go through the legislative quagmire we were already going through in order to reduce overall the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Those talks were always things that you heard in hallways or amongst individuals off the record, but it was something that definitely worried people in the executive office leadership about framing up climate intervention as anything remotely related to a policy framework element. The final thing I'd like to talk about with that is that when I was at USGCRP leading the 13 federal agencies, or helping to lead with the 13 federal agencies, it was very clear, and I didn't have this personal problem because I wasn't the guy directly in charge of a single line item of budget authority. But when you talk to people who did have line item authority in their agency and were responsible for money to any of the agencies, the little ones or the big ones, they were very much worried about budget reductions because the work was labeled as being climate science. And, you know, I think all of you are well versed enough in that and the politics to know what I'm talking about. But the bottom line is that we were seeing specific language being written into approps bills that were definitely dissuading agencies from participating in things as simple as the National Climate Assessment. And if that were the case, if we were to talk about something as controversial as climate engineering, people in the agencies were very much concerned that they may see a significant reduction or loss of the climate science side of those line elements. Now, let me pause for a second and say there's a positive side to this. There's a silver lining in this seeded cloud of ours, and that is that the agency folks, when we started to get together and talk about the specific activities going on in the agencies, there is climate science, there is scientific research going on in the agencies that is directly related to things like solar radiation management, but climate engineering or climate intervention writ large. And it's the foundation, much of it is the foundational work that needs to go on in order to build up and to really understand at a systems level the kinds of things that we need to understand, so that if we do ever get to the point of implementing any of these interventions on climate change, we understand the system well enough to know that we're not going to produce unintended consequences that are going to have serious or catastrophic ramifications to the environment, to the people of the world, or to the planet itself. Now, there are some other positive things that are going on in the agencies, as well as the acknowledgement that there's science that's already directly relevant. One of those things, and I see Ed Dunley is here from the National Academies, are several reports, including a recent one by the National Academies on climate engineering, led by Marcia McNutt, ably supported by Ed and others, that really talks in a very positive light about what we can do and what we should be able to do moving into the future. So there is discussion about a way forward with climate intervention that I find very attractive and very hopeful. There are other signs of hope in the congressional world, up in the legislative world. Things like House Resolution 424, which is to develop a bipartisan climate caucus, starting with House members, but I hope across House and Senate, in which the rule for playing is that if you're a Democrat and you want to be part of the caucus, you have to bring a Republican with you to be invited. And conversely, if you're a Republican, and there are some that initiated this and that supported this House resolution for the climate caucus, if you're a Republican, you'll bring a Democrat with you. This kind of bipartisan activity that's becoming more open, we've seen bits and pieces of behind closed doors. There is a desire to work across party lines at some level, in some degree. And I am an optimist by nature, take that at face value. But I'm starting to see things open up that will allow us, I think, to promote dialogues like this, to use this as a springboard for the future in educating people in both the legislative branch as well as the executive branch about the facts and the realities that Doug and Jane talked about. We're not going to get to 2 degrees C or 1.5 for the island nations by just reducing emissions alone. It's becoming very, very clear. Even if we were to do that today, it's not going to happen. My time is running out, but what I want to leave you with is I hope this little bit of novella here was enough to just whet your appetite about what the federal government's doing, but I hope it also promotes some optimism that what we're trying to do in the world of climate intervention does have hope, it does have opportunity, and I think soon with a little bit of education, it'll be seen as a necessity. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ted to kind of wrap things up. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tom. So my charge is to talk about governance and I guess provide a transition to the discussions for the rest of the day and the ongoing work in the working group. That's a big topic. I'm going to cut it way down. I'm going to offer you a couple of compact observations about where the climate engineering governance debates are and have been and what's needed. And I'm going to pose a few big questions that I would suggest need serious attention from people like the working group that's being established here, both domestically and internationally. I'm drawing partly on discussions from an international meeting on governance of climate engineering that I convened in October with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, including several people in the room at their Bellagio Center in Italy, and then also some observations just on my ongoing interest and work in this field. My two observations. So Jane and I have spoken together on many planets. We've spoken together on many planets.
Where were you?
It's a pleasure to be here on this lovely planet, and I do hope you can keep it. And we're fond of the joke drawn from the old anthropological observation that people are either lumpers or splitters. I'm a splitter.
I'm a lumper.
See? But I'm going to act like a lumper today in that I'm going to point out two big dichotomies, two big pairs of things that the climate engineering debate has been trying really hard to keep separate, mostly I think out of fear, because when you acknowledge how linked they are, it's very scary, but that have to be, conceptually and practically have to be considered together. So the first of these dichotomies is climate engineering research and climate engineering operational use. almost all of the governance debate thus far has focused on near-term questions of governance of climate engineering research. This is important, this is valuable. Thinking about research and its governance is essential. And even control of research in a field as controversial as this poses novel challenges, but it is not acceptable to continue limiting governance discussions only to consider research. You have to talk also about looking ahead and even now considering some of the risks and needs that would be posed by a future world in which people are bringing forward proposals for operational interventions and full-scale deployment. Why do you have to think about that now? There's a couple of reasons. One is there will be serious proposals to conduct operational scale interventions. And they will come from surprising collections of actors worldwide. I think many of the discussions of climate engineering governance are kind of in denial because this is so big, so potentially transformative, and so frightening. The risks of bad consequences of destabilization in the international system of all kinds are so serious. You also have to talk about this now because if it ever happens that climate engineering research proceeds, research at larger scales of intervention proceeds, and at some point people are talking about operational interventions, which I've said will happen, the phases of research and operational decisions and controversies will not be cleanly separated. They will blur into each other temporally and conceptually, let alone politically. So the notion that you can figure out the research, get the research going and figure out how to do that and not think ahead about the harder, more contentious stuff, I think is mistaken and dangerous. And I think it is also mistaken to imagine that if you just get research going and think about the governance of that, that spontaneously, autonomously, from the bottom up, through a diffuse process of norm development, somehow it will happen, that a capacity to deal with the higher stakes, more contentious questions around operational interventions will somehow emerge. It's a bunch of people who've published things saying that. I'm among them. I recant. I think it's mistaken. We might be lucky in that way, but I think it is dangerous and misguided to count upon spontaneous emergence as a way to avoid the responsibility for explicit advanced forethought about risks and requirements. So it would be a real mistake to wait until the first large-scale proposal, demand, or realized intervention lands to start thinking about how to react, control, and govern such things. Moreover, even while talking about specific decisions that are more near-term and focused and pertain primarily to the governance of research projects, it is essential that in those debates there also be 5 or 10% of our minds thinking ahead to implications that these near-term choices may have for larger scale operational decisions and the controversies they would raise. Because absent some clear break or transition in the debate and the actions around it, early decisions may have long echoes for future consequences. If not as formal precedents, then at least as shapers of perceptions and expectations and reactions. And so even while planning research programs and consultation and advisory bodies and informal international collaboration around those, be thinking about what this might mean or presage or put in place that could affect the future harder questions. Okay, so that's the first of my two, I wish we could split these, but we can't. The second of my, I wish we could split these, but we can't, is climate engineering and the rest of the climate agenda. Oddly, there has been nearly a complete disconnect in explicit discussion so far between the people who do climate change and the people who do climate engineering. The communities have a little bit of overlap, but the discussions almost never take place around the same tables or under the same institutions. There is an almost desperate attempt to kind of keep this stuff off the table while we get the mitigation going, in the climate meeting. And that's an understandable sentiment. I mean, there is a sense in which mitigation is essential, is first, and has to get going, and for all kinds of reasons. Nevertheless, the climate change agenda writ large is already at risk. It's permeable. It's penetrated by climate engineering in a whole bunch of ways. It is possible to read the results of the Paris meeting, actually, as Oliver did in some subsequent commentary he wrote upon it, as kind of shouting about all the ways that we're not talking about climate engineering, but we are making ourselves vulnerable to subsequent disruption of the agenda by its coming onto the agenda at a kind of unknown time in an unknown way. Consider the implicit and ever-growing reliance upon net negative emissions in the second half of the 20th century, and how that implicit reliance grows stronger as the ostensible temperature limitation targets are tightened up without a corresponding tightening of the mitigation effort that would be needed to even have a small chance of getting there. Consider the implications of the move to a decentralized structure based upon national statements of INDCs, where it's no longer central decisions from the top down, it's every nation says what they're going to do in quite an open-ended way. Well, it's just not plausible to me that over the second or third round of revisions of those, that some nations' proposals of their contributions are going to bleed over into the climate engineering space. Rhetorically, climate engineering may get subsumed into elastic definitions of the two main forms of responses. You don't have to stretch too far to regard carbon interventions as kind of extreme or novel mitigation, or to regard SRM-based interventions as extreme or novel adaptation. It's also permeable because the shift of attention, which has so far taken place not in the climate convention but around the margins, towards short-lived forcers as an alternative way to have early action that has early impacts, that also is a new vulnerability to penetration by climate engineering, because astonishingly, all the conversations about short-lived forcers appear to be silent on the fact that short-lived forcers have both signs. And as efficacious and in the short term as reducing the positive forcers could be increasing or not reducing the negative forces. So there is another kind of passive, implicit vulnerability of the agenda to penetration of an active engineered agenda. So you can't keep it off the agenda. It's likely to come on at an unknown time with disruptions that are hard to foresee in their specific character. These interactions can't be avoided, they need to be managed, they need to be anticipated, and ideally directed toward constructive. Now, early thinking about interactions between climate engineering and the rest of the agenda have all focused on the one very salient, unintended, and negative form of interaction, which has already been mentioned by several of my co-panelists and is indeed a very important one. It is the concern that the prospect or the presence or the conduct of engineered interventions of any kind would provide a tempting, cheap, easy alternative to doing the essential but hard work that we have to do to cut mitigation. I do not mean to disparage that as a legitimate concern. It absolutely is a legitimate and serious concern. 5, thank you. But I want to submit that's not the only interaction, and the interactions don't have to be passive and negative. And some early thinking about interactions that is more expansive and considers the possibility of attempting to harness them in a constructive way is urgently needed. Okay, let me close. Let me be a little provocative. Nah.
Just going to start now?
Nah, okay. I'm going to throw it. Here's a few questions that I wish somebody would answer. And this working group seems like a really good group to try to answer them, so maybe you could do them. I'm going to parse them into near, medium, and long-term questions, but you don't have to take them in chronological order. In fact, there may be a lot of value of like jumping ahead to the end and then working back, or starting in the middle and spreading out in both ways. But, you know, just because we speak in straight lines, I'll do it chronologically. Here are 4 questions about near-term issues related to governance of climate engineering research. Scale limits, public consultation, protection against lock-in, and how much internationalization, how soon? Each of those briefly. If we assume that climate engineering, SRM, field research programs are established, or SRM curious programs, or SRM inclusive programs, do they need, should they have explicit statements of limitations upon the scale of permissible intervention? And if so, what should those be, in what units, and who, by whom, and by what process should they be established? Jane, in her remarks, suggested that the notion of pressing for an actual quantitatively defined boundary was wrong-headed because the system's too complex, and what you need is something more like individualized sui generis assessment of risk for every proposed intervention. Maybe. I don't think that quite resolves the question. I think there's still an open question of whether there are good substantive or institutional or political reasons to say, here and no further, figure out what you want to do in here. And of course, you don't escape risk assessment by falling within the boundary. We're just telling you what we'll consider and what we won't. As some of you know, David, Keith, and I think, are still the only ones who have actually stuck our necks out to propose a number for, actually a pair of numbers for how authorized research programs should be limited. Public consultation. Everybody wants public consultation. Here's the question. What form, how much, and what process of consultation or outside advice, beyond what is normal for scientific research program management, is needed for SRM programs? To what end? What is the purpose? What is the risk against which the consultation and advisory processes aim to protect? And what does that imply for how you set them up? Lock-in and slippery slope. Everybody worries. Was that time or was that 2? Thanks. A prominent worry about this stuff is if you take one little step, you won't be able to stop from going the whole distance, right? Subversion of public decisions and policy debate by communities of self-interest, be they intellectual, bureaucratic, commercial, or whatever. Here's the question. What bits of program design, what breakpoints, what requirements of reauthorization, what limits on private finance or private IP would give reasonable confidence that the enterprise is maintained under legitimate public control and isn't from the first spraying of 10 kilograms of SO2 in the stratosphere, isn't a locomotive out of control. And then how early international consultation and cooperation? Do you need it, or is it okay to start national programs first? Goodness knows it's a lot easier to establish national research programs and then have informal consultation and sharing of information. Is that okay? Medium-term questions. They're about the interactions. So the interactions of SRM or CE broadly with the rest of the climate agenda. What are the most serious mechanisms by which pursuing SRM might undermine the rest of the mitigation resolve, and how can they be counteracted? Is it possible to structure the overall climate agenda in a way that makes these things complementary? So somehow through explicit bargaining linkage or other mechanisms, the pursuit of SRM actually strengthens rather than weakens mitigation resolve? And 3, nobody talks about sources of interaction between SRM and adaptation. Why is that? Is that because there aren't any? Climate engineering and adaptation. Is that because there aren't any interactions? I think that merits a little investigation. What are they? How might they operate? And what are the associated risks? The long-term questions, this is the look ahead and envision a different world. What would a world successfully dealing with climate engineering and its governance and climate change look like? What enhanced capabilities in international governance authority, resources, decision processes would have to be in place for this to be an okay issue, not a catastrophic problem? It might be worth doing some explicit scenario exercises, looking forward and looking back here. What would a world look like that investigated and researched climate engineering and then decided never to deploy it? Would it be possible for such a world to be doing fine in managing climate change in the rest of it? How might that come about? What would that imply for international capabilities and authorities to make that decision? Because goodness knows, a decision not to do it is an international decision which requires a capacity to make such decisions. That's enough. I'm out of time. I was going to say, to be really provocative, I was going to say, sharpening questions is great. If your group does that, fine, you've made a contribution. But we don't really make any progress until people stick their necks out and propose answers, right? It's very complicated. I know it's very complicated, but it's like stuff has to get done, decisions have to get made. And if not a group like this, and if not now, then who and when? And it'll be answers you don't like as much as this very wise and suitably constructed group sat together for a year and thought really hard about it and came up with the best it could do. So you should do it. I have some answers to some of these, but I'm out of time, so I can't tell you. Thank you.
I get a feeling, Ted, that you've queued up a question. So I'm going to ask the members of the working group whether they have questions initially, or reserve the first couple of questions for members of the working group in case there's anything you'd like to speak to. Katrina.
Question for
And
Doug.
I'm going to pass this around just so your voice can be captured on the recording.
So a question for Doug. You said quickly that SRM could plausibly reduce suffering. So how can you say that with confidence, given the number of models you've got and what it is that they're modeling? And what do you mean by suffering, and whose suffering could plausibly be reduced?
That's an excellent question. The reason that I can say that with confidence is only that plausible is a very weak word.
Okay.
Yes, these are climate models, but there is, there's a very basic piece of physics, right? If you reduce the amount of radiation reaching the planet, it will get cooler. And it will, there are certainly a number of climate impacts that are related to that, like sea level rise and so forth. The longer answer to your question is probably several hours, and the real answer would be we don't know, in part because we don't know how to translate climate effects to climate impacts very well.
Okay.
So we actually don't know that much about, what would the impact on fisheries be or something like that, because we don't know what climate variables to look at for that. And they're probably at a regional enough scale that we don't know what's going to happen even with climate change. So plausible, I think, is probably the strongest word that I can come up with, and I can certainly name people who would be better off without any climate engineering. For example, if you want to drill in the Arctic, you'd be better off without climate engineering. You'd also be better off without mitigation.
Yeah, I was thinking more of people whose, food security would be damaged, or,
Yeah, so precipitation changes due for several reasons due to climate change. One is simply that in a warmer world holds more moisture. So you increase the hydrological cycle, and broadly wetter regions get wetter and drier regions get drier. And so if you cool the planet, you tend to reverse those effects, broadly speaking. But you're cooling the planet with a different radiative forcing mechanism so you're cooling from reducing the top of atmosphere solar forcing instead of cooling by, instead of the warming from CO2 that's warming in the mid-atmosphere and absorbing the infrared and reflecting it back to the surface. And those have different effects on stability of the atmosphere and hydrological cycle broadly. So you don't wind up compensating precipitation even if you were to apply the exact same spatial pattern of radiative forcing. So there's a difference in the effect on the climate because you've got a different mechanism of radiative forcing, solar versus CO2, and a difference in the spatial pattern because you're only cooling when the sun is shining. So those all basically have different impacts on all of the climate variables. Precipitation is just sort of an example of one that people might care about. And models are, basically the climate models don't agree on the sign of precipitation response at a regional scale, even with CO2 warming, let alone CO2 warming and geoengineering. So I think plausible is the strongest statement that I could make today.
Okay, thank you.
Microphone to Prakash on this side. And then I have Paul, and then I see Rafe and Mark. And Prakash, can you give us your name and also where you're from?
I'm Prakash Kashwan, University of Connecticut. I have two questions to Jane and Tom. Jane, I was wondering if you would like to elaborate a little bit on the idea of institutional vested interest. And I'm presuming that you were thinking of designing institutional means for bringing institutional vested interest into light. I think that becomes even more important after Ted mentioned a surprising collection of actors might come into picture, right? To Tom, I was really interested in the way you talked about adaptation and looking at observations, and I was wondering if within the US government, with reference to your mention of indigenous groups, was there a discussion about differential impacts of climate change, and so the need for designing differential interventions to help along different kinds of groups? Thank you.
That's a great question, and it's not one that I think I'm as deep in as I'd like to be. I just there are people like Todd Laporte, who was at Berkeley, who looked very carefully at high reliability institutions. Although I have to say he's very discouraging to talk to because he doesn't think there are any. But I think you can look at things that will create situations that are inherently bad. Like, for example, you can reward people for having the right answer, or you can reward people for coming forward saying, this won't work, it's wrong. And I think that setting up a reward system and making it a positive event when you've discovered that some technology that you're working on is a bad idea is probably a key attribute. Another is kind of not continuing with, we've, post the Vannevar Bush era, I think we kind of went into this research area where we were all competing. We were all trying to act like little businesses. I think that's a very bad format for this type of research. We've kind of lost the ability to do mission-driven research because we had bad experience with how it went. So, I think one really interesting question for a group like this would be, how would you reinvent mission-driven research to avoid the problems that we had in the past, and yet create a sense of common purpose among a bunch of investigators who realize that they're a part of a whole thing that's trying to understand a system. And I think several of our people on the panel have brought up the idea that this is a system. This is a broad thing. It's not one idea coming in with, hey, I can save the world. I'm going to shoot sulfur in the atmosphere and it's all going to be great. It's just not going to be simple like that. So in order to have people that work on a system, I think you need people that are dedicated researchers that aren't thinking that, hey, if I don't have the best idea here, I'm not going to get funded. They need to, there's some element of working together to create some mission. But, at the same time, mission-driven research resulted in an enormous insult to the environment during the Cold War. And, there were reasons that happened, and we have to be careful that we don't recreate those. So, I think a sense of purpose is really important, that being wrong or finding fault with the idea is equally valid and important as finding that it's a good idea. How many papers have you read about people telling you what bad ideas they had for research? I mean, there's just none. So, it's really important to say, probably the most important thing about research in this area is to make sure that as we become fairly desperate in the next 50, 100 years, that we don't just pull the trigger on something that we don't know anything about. So that's really some ideas about it, but I'm sure there are many more.
So I'll take the question for Tom, since I'm Tom. And I want to start by going back to the question that was asked before about suffering, because I think that's directly relevant to your question about adaptation. It seems simple to say, and it seems just like a logical thing, but I think we need to be clear that, I've been looking recently at climate models for the Arctic that predict that the average winter temperature in the Arctic by the end of this century, if we were to continue on the business as usual case that what Doug showed before, could be as much as 12 degrees Celsius higher by the end of the century than it is today. Now, what does that mean? Well, okay, 12 degrees, it's a number. It's a damn number, So what do we really care about that number? When you think about a day that's 75 degrees versus 32, you think about how that impacts your day-to-day life. And that's getting to impacts and effects and consequences. That's what we're really after with understanding climate change. It's not just understanding the system or understanding it's going to be warmer or colder, but it's understanding what does that mean in terms of rain? What does that mean in terms of drought? What does that mean in terms of sea ice or albedo change that's going to impact you and the world that you live in? On the adaptation side, going back to your immediate question, when we presented our budget package at DOI, we've always stuck to not the models and what the models were projecting for the future, but started out with what are the immediate observations we're making today about a changing landscape. And that was the start of our adaptation strategy as well. What's actually changing on the ground? And then the onus of responsibility becomes, and the challenge scientifically as well as from a policy standpoint and a legal standpoint as well, becomes attribution. What can we actually attribute to changing climate conditions as part of that adaptation strategy? So if you're going to adapt, you're going to change your behavior. How do you know that changing your behavior is going to actually succeed in making something better that you need to define and measure yourself? Well, the only way to really do that, know that, is there's one way. You could just roll the dice and hope and think you know, or you could go out and use attribution studies and attribution analysis to really figure out, especially right away, the low-hanging fruit that are out there. And this gets back to differential impacts. You go out and you pick up the low-hanging fruit. What are the things that we know? We have a high degree of certainty and confidence in knowing that if we take this action, it's going to succeed because this is connected to temperature increase or change in climate, change in the long-term climate change or change in climate variability. That's where you need to start. And a lot of what we did in the last working group 2 work of AR5 with IPCC was attribution specific. It was related to understanding the connection between working group 1 and climate impacts, and what does that mean in terms of impacts and effects? What are the consequences? What is going to change in our life and our lifestyles that we think scientifically we have a good enough handle on to say with a high degree of confidence that if you do this to the climate, then this is going to occur to your daily life or to the world we live in. And then from that, you develop your adaptation strategy. So on the issue of differential impacts, I'd like to just, after maybe at the coffee break, talk to you more specifically, because that's a longer conversation. But I really think we need to understand that we're not just after understanding the temperature's going to rise or temperature's going to fall. It's the real scientific challenge and the policy challenge as well. A large one is understanding the connection between those changes and what actually is going to change in terms of both positive, the way you describe it, positive or negative impacts and effects to your daily life or your long-term well-being, as well as to the well-being of the planet. And, frankly, what might be a bad thing for some people is a good thing for others. There are opportunities as well as catastrophes out there. And really what you have to be able to do is connect those changes in climate back to what the actual physical, biological, social, psychological consequences are going to be.
I just thought of another piece of the answer. A lot depends on the question you ask. So, for example, for the institutional reliability. So, for example, in the United States, we created a competition between 5 sites and 3 sites on nuclear waste storage, and each of them had a different contractor. And we said, "Show us that this site is suitable for nuclear waste storage." So they cheated and lied, because that was how they would be better than the other guy. None of them are really very suitable. So in Sweden, what they did was they created a study which created the criteria for a site, and then they looked for sites that met that criteria. Consequently, they're getting a repository. We have billions of dollars spent and no repository in the United States. So I think basically one of the things that you guys could work on is, how do you ask the question? because that really makes a huge difference.
Queuing up some good questions for the working group, which is good. We have about 20 minutes left in the session. I want to call in Rafe and Mark. Can we take your questions together? And then there are a couple of other members of the working group who had their hands up.
I'll do the first half of the second. Great panel. I'd like to try a couple of themes that seem to be, might be an addition to how the priorities of the research agenda, and emphasize two things. I think one was in Doug's and Ted's, Tom mentioned it too, but one is timing. We have a serious problem because the issue is not being defined, and when precisely does research need to begin in order to achieve what end? That's the first thing. It's much, and I think that the the Paris Agreement, as somebody said, backed into it. Because the ridiculous notion that we can achieve 1.5 degrees centigrade without this tool backs the international community into it. And I'm just going to think on the point that Ted made about this disruptive intervention, unexpected, happened in Paris. And where did it come from? It came from the island nations because of sea level rise. So, research agenda, stack the geoengineering interventions against specific effects in addition to your average global temperature, because the only thing that's driving politics in this country are specific effects. Take Florida. Florida's history, if we allow sea level rise to go on under business as usual. Well, why aren't Florida politicians asking the geoengineering question? Other point that Doug mentioned was about the permafrost question. Permafrost is another one that's easily understood because it's an easy question for politicians. Can we let the permafrost go? Double the carbon content of the atmosphere. So what's relevant? Well, bring it up to the moment. On Thursday, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, President Obama are going to meet. And the unraveling of the Arctic will be on the agenda, but they won't ask the question, when do we have to stop the permafrost thawing? And that's kind of our job, to get the timescales on the table.
So if I get the second half of the question, I'm going to keep it shorter.
Sorry. You didn't set a timescale on the question.
Time is
So-
elastic.
I'll keep the shorter part. I've got a comment for Ted and a question for Tom, although I'm not sure quite yet how to pose the question for Tom. It's something that's bugging me, but I'll see if I can get it across well. The comment for Ted is a simple one. First off, excellent overview, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking, provocative on climate engineering. Just the part on the SLCPs. I spend about 2/3 of my time on short-lived climate-forcing pollutants, the SLCPs, and about 1/3 of it on the climate engineering part. And the perspective that you brought is about 3 or 4 years out of date. So that is the way that thinking was in the community several years ago. It's really moved forward, and you could really see that at Paris. We're on the steering committee of the CCAC, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and so on. This thought of using SLCPs as an alternative or as a substitute for buying time for CO2. Some people are still using that terminology, but for the most part, amongst the 50 environmental ministers that are present in the CCAC, that thinking is out now, and they really understand it's an addition. It's not an alternative. And the same thing with the warming and the cooling pollutants. There's an understanding that if we do something to reduce CO2 emissions, it's going to have to involve power plants, which means coal, which means we're going to reduce SO2 also, which means that basically the narrative becomes we have to also consider the warming SLCPs because we're going to do something about the cooling SLCP. So that's moved forward some. But I'm glad you brought that up as an issue. Tom, thank you for that insight into Washington politics and how climate engineering has worked its way into that. The question that I have for you is, you used the term necessity. You said we might see it as a necessity, and I hear this a good bit. And I'm always curious, for whom is it necessary? Why would climate engineering be considered necessary? And if it's considered necessary, what else comes along with it that would be equally considered necessary? Would it be necessary that we reduce international shipping of, say, tons of wine from France to California, California to Australia, Australia back to France? Would it become necessary that we reduce meat consumption, necessary that we reduce our international travel? If you look around the room, this meeting probably means 40 tons of CO2 for the people to be at this meeting. Is that necessary? What else becomes necessary if we get to the level that climate engineering would be considered necessary? And I see you have a lot of compassion and desire to reduce suffering behind this understanding of necessary. So I'd be very interested to get your insights into that, what necessary is and what else would be necessary.
Any 30-second responses?
I don't think that was shorter incident.
Yeah, I failed.
It sounded
I
a lot
failed
better.
miserably.
Can I give a few
We sang
10-second
together.
I have an
responses?
amendment.
Okay.
Because I was the person in a meeting several years ago who suggested we take the short-lived forcers to the Arctic Council. Because why do we do that? That came out of the Clean Air Task Force and a group called Clean Air, Cool Planet. Because of the urgency. But you know what the other element of that agenda was that couldn't be mentioned? That the Arctic Council was geoengineering. It was politically impossible. The motivation was because the Arctic's deteriorating so fast, we got to act. Was it enough? Obviously not. But you couldn't talk about geoengineering. But that the short-lived forcers' diplomatic history was that it started in the Arctic for a good reason. Now our times are equal.
Okay. 10-second responses to 2 or 3 separate points. Aims of research. The near-term aims of research are to demonstrate whether particular modes of intervention would work without clear, extreme harmful effects that would basically put them off the table. And so it is to refine the sense of possibility, which presently is kind of diffusely based on a set of model runs plus some physics we knew from before. When should the research start? It should have started 10 years ago, so sooner the better. Timescale for intervention, in a sense, that's in Doug's picture. I mean, in a sense, there's no clear breakpoints. It's like earlier is better for every intervention because it buys time on all. Mark, if you thought I was accusing the short-lived pollutant debate of thinking it was an alternative rather in addition to long, then I misspoke. That was not my intention. And actually, we don't have any disagreement at all. My charge is that a shift to debate on short-lived opens up the possibility for considering short-lived of all kinds, which has not been proposed yet because the agenda is cutting the heating ones. And yes, maybe cutting them in response to desired cuts in cooling ones that come with other pollutants, but it is one of the modes of disruption that is as yet unaccounted for. Was Paris the disruption? Maybe, implicitly. The contradiction is now on the table, but the emperor's nobody has spoken about the emperor's clothes. So in historical retrospect, we'll look back and say, oh yeah, the disruption occurred from Paris to 10 years afterwards, and it'll be sort of diffuse. I don't know, at some point it'll come on explicitly, and that hasn't happened yet. Right now there's a contradiction and a bunch of magical thinking going on around the contradiction.
We have about 10 minutes left in the session. I think for the purposes of the process, it's going to be most useful to gather some remaining questions, even if we don't get to address all of them, because we have the rest of the day to consider them. So, Elizabeth, I see, and then we had a few other people over here. Please.
Yeah, we're good.
So we have volcanic research to date that indicates to a high degree of certainty that droughts result from increases of this nature of atmospheric change, Pinatubo and others. So, and they also tend to not occur in the locations where the initial eruption or intended, geoengineering activity would occur. So some of that research has already been compiled to a specificity with which many people are concerned that while this can be beneficial, perhaps continentally, it's not necessarily beneficial globally, and that leads to geopolitical consequences. I've been part of these climate negotiations for decades now, and it's a sovereignty-based process. That's clear. That's one thing that's very clear. decision-making at the international level is a sovereignty-based process. So once you have an activity that is going to benefit certain regions and leave enormous question marks in the form of drought leading to famine in other regions, this is bringing up the question of banning rather than transparency for many groups that are tasked with responding to the concept of geoengineering. So in some communities, you're talking about the nuances of how do you put transparency around the discussions of research and possible implementation. In other discussions, you're really talking about banning something that, given the natural research, the volcanic research that's already happened without human intervention, one known outcome is lack of predictable water, which is already an issue in the climate discussion. So heat is one very important factor, but water and the unpredictable nature in which water is going to appear and not appear in different regions is another important factor. So how do you respond to that for the whole, many communities which don't want to get past the word ban?
I just want to give a very, very quick answer or comment on that. The broader question is definitely an important one, but one does have to be a bit careful with the volcanic analog. One of the reasons that there is drought in certain places after a volcano is that the land cools down faster than the ocean, so you reduce the monsoonal precipitation. That's not necessarily true. That would be true if you basically did a very abrupt start to geoengineering, but it's not necessarily true if you do a gradual start to geoengineering. So the broader question is definitely one that is important. It's very actually unclear today how to predict the regional, winners and losers, for lack of a better word. But the specific concern is not as critical as it might have been phrased.
Arti, Andrew, Nitra. We can bring the microphone down here, Selena, into this cluster.
Thanks a lot. Arti Gupta, Wageningen University. Well, I wanted to ask Ted a question, and thanks to the panelists, this was fascinating. About governance, of course, and this is sort of a first-order basic question. So we talk about governance as some sort of emergence of shared norms and principles around this issue. I was very struck by you saying that, that there is this sense in a lot of existing thinking that it's going to emerge organically in a sort of decentralized way, and that you had said so perhaps in some previous publications, but you recant, and you put that issue in your short-term, sort of near-term set of questions about how much international collaboration, cooperation is needed on this kind of, how are we going to discuss the sort of broader high-stakes issues? And that may not emerge organically from sort of project-based assessments of, how you understand the specifics, looking at specific projects. So I was just wondering, you said you had some answers to some of your questions. So whether you had a sense of this, the question you posed about the international collaboration, and also you mentioned the Paris Agreement and the fact that, and this has been discussed a bit already, the elephant in the room that the Paris Agreement sort of doesn't refer to, but it's there. And so I wonder just very specifically what role you saw for the UNFCCC. You said it hasn't been actively addressed. Are there risks? Are there benefits from bringing this more actively within the UNFCCC, and what your take on that would be? Thanks.
That's a lot. I can see Simon looking at me telling, take no more than 10 seconds per point. The point that I said I recanted, a little flippantly, was the reliance upon spontaneous bottom-up emergence of norms with no intentional, no state engagement, no interstate discussions. Governance conversations must take place early. My opinion is that the best way for an early start is that in parallel with early research, there are informal consultations among officials in sort of multiple nations, those doing research programs, those interested but not doing, that those should initially be mostly around research and transparency and sharing of results and so on. I think it is unavoidable that there will at some point be interstate explicit negotiations over authorizations, permissions, limits, compensation, control, governance authority. And I don't think that happens exclusively bottom up. UNFCCC, I don't know, not right now. They're busy trying to get off the starting line on mitigation, and I think a distraction from that would be troublesome. I think now I'm really being speculative, I think there are grounds for some parallel discussion, perhaps initially in some kind of eminent persons World Commission kind of forum, appropriately representative and broad in its composition. Perhaps in interstate negotiations that would actually develop some new capacity, perhaps to subsequently be merged in with the rest of the climate regime. I think the climate regime, the FCCC and company, it's like the people on the Secretariat know this is coming, and they're not talking about it, I think, appropriately and intentionally. And I think that's because they have a hard job herding the cats they're already trying to herd.
Let me just take questions then from Nitra and from Andrew. Just to wrap up the session. We'll proceed for the next session.
This is Netra Chetri from Arizona State University. It's for Ted particularly, and then I'll come back to Doug as well later on. Ted, towards your end of the talk, you mentioned about a disconnect between adaptation and geoengineering. And then, can you elaborate that a little bit more, how they are connected? And then there's, for Doug, after the Pinatubo eruption, we see a lot of that. About 3 years, the temperature went down a little bit. Do we know how precipitation changed around that time globally?
Went down. I don't know what, my point was merely that the potential interactions between climate engineering and adaptation have not yet been elaborated. To the extent that there has been discussion of interactions between climate engineering and the rest of the agenda, the great majority has focused on the worry that the prospect of climate engineering would undermine political will for mitigation. It would provide a tempting, easy out that isn't really a solution and so would misallocate effort. How it might interact with adaptation, the one way I've thought of so far is that I can imagine it's getting onto the agenda by being characterized as adaptation. I can imagine attempted regional scale interventions that grow out of regional weather modification programs that nations might undertake in the aim of reducing climate impacts, better or worse informed to some degree, or characterized as adaptation and so put onto the international agenda that way. I'm sure there's more and it merits examination, and I don't know what it is.
But just a short comment on that. I think basically the idea that regions, localities would experience extreme events and want to deal with them has already happened. So, for example, people have tried in Indonesia, I believe, to rain out big storms over the ocean so that they don't get flooded. And there's some ideas about steering monsoons, and there are ideas about cooling heat waves locally. The thing that's striking about this to me is I think the ability to act on these regional levels, in other words, to govern, if you like, and to take action is very high compared to international decision to globally engineer the earth, but the science is missing. So it's kind of a lot of scientific thought has been given to global intervention, but local interventions, which I agree with Ted, grow out of weather modification, a lot of them fail, and the science of actually doing this stuff is missing. But I think what's going to happen is these two phenomena are going to grow towards each other, because as global climate engineering starts to look at more, where Doug pointed out, in these models we just kind of turn down the sun. Well, we're going to start to say, well, what about if I inject here or I inject there, or I actually tweak this and tweak that and put it all together in some kind of a machine that manages things so that we don't lose rainfall or monsoons or whatever, that is actually going to create local interventions to do the global, and it's going to come from the other direction where localities look at, I can't take this anymore, we have to do something, And we're going to, and some of that stuff could be extremely misguided. In fact, Pablo has some wonderful examples of extreme misguided actions. So I think the science is lagging at that end. It's lagging everywhere, but it's particularly lagging at that end.
I want to make sure that we get Andrew's comment. Yes.
I can be very brief because RT actually already asked my question to Ted, which was about the role of the Framework Convention. But I would disagree that it's about the reason the Framework Convention is probably not the appropriate forum is not about that they've got a lot of work to do. Hopefully they'll always have a lot of work to do in the Secretariat, good work. It's that historically both the convention and all of the agreements that have come out of the convention, including the Kyoto Protocol, have been agnostic about what parties actually do, what their measures are to hit their targets, whether they're targets that are top-down or bottom-up. And I think that's appropriate. There could be some precedents for the work that have been done in the transparency and the accounting rules in the forestry sector, and more recently in the Paris Agreement, in the markets part of the agreement, that would of course be necessary for global governance of SRM. But at the end of the day, I think that the only way the INDC structure actually is going to have the integrity that it does and the buy-in that it does, in fact, is if parties get to decide how they're going to hit their targets. I totally agree with you, though, that we're going to see at least the other side of geoengineering, right, carbon reduction technology, probably in the next round of INDCs in 2025 come forward. But given the 5-year cycles, I think it will be very, very modest in terms of what people say they're going to be able to do in that respect.
Can I respond real quick?
Real quick.
Yeah. I agree, and I didn't mean to suggest that was the only reason. Another reason is related to the character of the governance capabilities that would that would have to be in place to imagine any kind of orderly global-scale decisions about what interventions were authorized. I mean, think about the politics of those decisions. All the questions that have been posed here about, oh, it might be good for them but bad for them, or it might be good for temperature but would be addressed and those are questions that there's a ton of scientific information that could help to inform, but a huge space for sincere or insincere misrepresentation of where scientific information is based upon shifting risk to other people. So the capabilities to make and implement decisions to authorize interventions are an extraordinary advance upon governing capability and authority at the international level. You are almost moving toward the construction of state-like power at the international level. If you add to that the fact that even interventions that are conducted would have uncertainties about effect on all time and spatial scales and would need to be competently managed, monitored, adapted, stopped if things look like they were going wrong, compensation schemes, there's a thickness of obligation and required functionality that has both a huge political challenge and a huge kind of technical and operational challenge. The capabilities required, I think, really do greatly exceed any existing international institution. So, you know, maybe it could be a future framework convention with hugely expanded power and authority and capability. Maybe it could be another body, but it's something the likes of which we haven't seen yet.
On that note, please join me in thanking our first panelists.